Then we have the DNA collection. You're hearing rumbles right now that perhaps everybody should give their DNA, and there's opposition to it, of course, but ultimately they will do that. And then we have profiling. We take all the data from the surveillance, the data collection, and we get into what we call profiling. This is a very important aspect to understand. Profiling leads to crime prevention. Or we could say crime prevention leads to profiling. Either way you want to look at it. In other words, when you get taken over by a socialist society, a communist dictatorship or of that nature, the first thing they do is they start to profile people. The reason they do it is they want to identify their political enemies, essentially. It doesn't have anything to do with crime control. This is identifying political enemies. And they call it crime prevention. In other words, instead of solving crimes, they move into a whole other area, crime prevention. Well, the only way you can prevent a crime is to profile people and analyze those profiles who might commit a crime. You see, all of this comes together. It's very, very important because that's what every socialist dictatorship does. It profiles people. And then, in the name of crime prevention, i.e. drugs, terrorism, hate crimes, you can round people up in the name of crime prevention. Now, by surveillance, data collection, DNA collection, iris scans, fingerprints, etc., you can establish positive ID. Now, the only way you can establish real positive ID is to give people what the Bible calls the mark of the beast. That's what it's for. It's really for positive control. Silent Weapons for Quiet Wars spoke about this very thing. They didn't call it the mark of the beast. They just said they wanted to put a computer chip in every man, woman, and child so that they could surveil their buying and their selling. In other words, you could not make a move without it being recorded by computer. They said they needed this so that they can have total economic control. Silent Weapons for Quiet Wars. And it leads to the mark of the beast, which in the Bible is 666. Okay, the next item is political control. The agenda for Iron Mountain is the primary weapon they're using on that. You can find out about it in the Humanist Manifesto, the Communist Manifesto, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, S-I-O-N, not Z-I-O-N, and it's an agenda of the secret societies. I know everybody says that that was a fake. Well, if it's a fake, then why are all the items in there being implemented? You see, this is brainwashing. You can brainwash the population and call these things fakes, like Iron Mountain is supposed to be a fake. Well, it wasn't. We have absolute proof that Iron Mountain was real. Anyway, through the agendas and the international bankers, they get the nations deeply in debt. All right? They also control the mass media for political control. Through the debt control, they can manipulate the politics of a nation. All right? Corrupt leaders. They find leaders that are corrupt so they can compromise them. They'll expose them if they don't do what they're told. Then in the end, it leads to a council of wise men and a world teacher and a world president out of the UN. That's what this whole thing is all about. Religious control is going to be done predominantly through the Blue Beam Project. And that is the projection of a holographic materials into the atmosphere along with holographic moving. These are moving pictures and sound. And what they intend to do is to project through satellite technology the arrival of a Messiah. It's all going to be a fake. Anyway, we're not talking about the Blue Beam Project, but what they do is they infiltrate and they destroy the Christian church is the primary target. They attack from the outside at the same time they infiltrate and destroy through apostasy, through reinterpretation, through infiltration into the prophetic ministries, so that they misinterpret the prophecies and get the masses of the Christians, those who do study biblical prophecy, to believe something that's not true. And this is how they do it. They infiltrate. And it's particularly so in the prophetic circles. And America is filled with false prophetic teachers. All right? Then they attack from the outside, after they've apostatized the church, they attack from the outside through media. They ridicule, they mock religion. And they get the people over a period of time to actually begin to think of religion as foolishness, and they literally destroy in the minds of the people any need for spiritual thirst. And then, at the end, what they intend to do is bring in their false Messiah. They've destroyed the real truth by attacking Christianity. All right? Then they will replace this with a world religion and their false Messiah. That's how it works. The Bible says that the rich men of the earth are the destroyers of the earth. Very, very strong language that the Lord uses. He says that they want to gain control over the earth, and they do it, evidently, partially anyway, by destroying the earth. Now, what does that actually mean? Well, if you in secret were to develop the technology so that through Tesla and advances that you made from the research Tesla had done, you could uncover all sorts of technologies. In fact, the insiders that come out of Area 51 and the underground bases, etc., claim that the technology is so far advanced we wouldn't believe it even if we saw it. Remember also that the Bible says that lying signs and wonders are employed to bring in the false Messiah. Lying signs and wonders is nothing more than high technology. But it's so high a technology that it seems like it's miracles from the gods themselves. But let's say you developed this technology. You did it in secret. Black operations, super secret tests and research. And you developed the technology so that you learned how to alter the weather. You learned how to cause earthquakes anywhere you wanted. You learned how to create severe storms. You learned that you could even alter the climate at the poles, and you could slowly melt the poles. You might be interested in the minerals. You might be interested in oil and gas exploration in those areas so that you could perpetuate the power that you already have. Iron Mountain is a book about how governments perpetuate their own power. It has nothing to do with whether the people want them in office or not. Power begets power, and power also begets corruption, and absolute power begets absolute corruption. The Bible says that evil men wax worse and worse, and one of the reasons they do is because they stay in power. They develop the means of psychological warfare, of fooling people, of mass psychological warfare. They do it through TV, they do it through movies, through radio, newspapers, and magazines. Everyone says that the protocols of the elders of Zion are fakes. It's very, very interesting that all of these things, the protocols of the elders of Zion, secret societies, the protocols found in the Communist Manifesto, etc., the Humanist Manifesto. Then we have silent weapons for quiet wars. We have Iron Mountain, the report from Iron Mountain. All of these things are, of course, fakes and frauds, but they're all being fulfilled. They all bespeak of manipulation, of fooling people, of deception, exactly what the Bible says, that as we near the end, the rich men of the earth, through their societies, get together and they start to manipulate the masses through deception. But now, to get back to this, if you could develop the technology to alter the Earth's climate any way you wanted, to create earthquakes, to do great harm to the surface of the earth, which sounds like what the Bible's talking about when it calls them the destroyers of the earth. We haven't had the technology to destroy the earth until Tesla came along. Tesla said, as we told you before, he could split the earth open like an apple. Kind of interesting then, isn't it? If you could secretly develop this technology and then turn around after you have done this and you've applied it and you are creating global warming yourselves, but then you turn around and you blame it on civilization, you blame it on this and you blame it on that, the masses of people, the useless eaters, then via that method, could you not bring in a draconian world government? Could you not frighten the people into accepting draconian controls? And after all, if it's a worldwide problem, we need a world government to solve it. Do we not? So then, because this is an environmental problem, people really shouldn't have the right to own their own property. After all, they could abuse it. They might not keep it as sustainable. You know, after all, we need sustainable development. You hear that word a lot. The Bible indicates all of this is basically a sham. But anyway, the rich men of the earth, they want to, according to the scriptures, bring in a world government, a draconian Nazi fascist police state. No freedom. The murder of millions of people is slated, and it's recorded in the scriptures. And in the final analysis, I guess you'd have to say it's a jihad, it's a holy war of Satan through his dupes, the occult, the secret societies, wage war upon Jesus Christ and God the Father. The whole effort is designed to overthrow the Lord. But okay, let's say you do this. Let's say it gets a little out of control. And you thought maybe it could get out of control. What would you do? After all, they know the prophecies. You know, you can understand Bible prophecy, and we know that the governments have studied it. You could know it and still not understand that you were fulfilling it. Israel, for example, knew the prophecies about the Messiah, and they killed their Messiah, and they said, it's better that this man die and Israel be saved. And by killing him, of course, Israel was saved. But isn't it interesting how they murdered him without even knowing they were fulfilling their own prophecies? Likewise, the rich men of the earth, there's no difference. They know and understand prophecy, but they're blind that they are the ones fulfilling it. And alternative 1, 2, and 3 are designed for one thing, we believe, to, first of all, destroy the earth, reduce the populations. They can do that through germ warfare. They can do it through wars. They can do it through massive earthquakes. They can raise the ocean levels by melting the poles. Now you're saying, well, this is awful evil. When the Bible says that people are evil, it's not fooling. The American people live in some sort of a dreamland. They have rose-colored glasses that they look through. It has very little to do with reality. It has very little to do with reality. The secret societies are behind this. We're going to show you a small clip from the History Channel, of all places, that ran a series on secret societies. It's very, very interesting. It verifies exactly what the Bible says. The rich men want to bring in a fascist police state. We could call it a new dark age, where the elite have the technology and the rest of us are to live like they did in the dark ages. They're going to take away much of the technology through draconian controls. If you don't believe it's going to happen, just stick around for a while and you will find out it is happening. We produced our video, the Iron Mountain Blueprint for Tyranny. Everything in that video is coming true. It wasn't because we said it would come true. It's because the Bible said it would come true.
The structure by which the world is controlled by a few people, literally a handful at the very top, is like Russian dolls, one doll inside another, inside another, inside another. I call this web in which they all fit the Illuminati, the illuminated ones, illuminated into knowledge that the rest of us don't get. And that Illuminati has been manipulating for centuries to bring about what is now appearing before our eyes.
The notion of a few hands that surreptitiously pull all the strings is not new. It is as old as the oldest secret societies.
With some of the most famous people in the world today, you find that their rituals are an absolute mirror of the ones that were carried out in Babylon, in Egypt, and the ancient world in general. It's an unbroken span of manipulation from the far ancient world to the present day.
Let's take a look at the report from Iron Mountain, fictitious and alternate enemies. In other words, if we move from war and we move into peace, we've got to come up with alternate enemies. It may be, for instance, that gross pollution of the environment can eventually replace the possibility of mass destruction by nuclear weapons as the principal apparent threat to the survival of the species. In other words, let's invent this. Trilateral Commission Report 1977, Collaboration with the Communist Countries in Managing Global Problems. International control, or UN control, of oceans and space. Trilateral Communist cooperation in the area of weather modification and earthquake control. This has to do with Tesla technology. And they have some cooperation going on. And we have black operations in on Alternative 1. Find ways to reduce global warming. Find ways to stop ozone depletion. And find ways to reduce the population. Those were actually what they wanted to do in Alternative 1. Reduction in global warming. 1. Blast holes in the ionosphere to release carbon dioxide buildup through either atomic bombs or HAARP, and that's carbon dioxide, 2. Scatter reflective materials in the high altitudes through the use of military and airline jet equipment using selective spray materials, and that's known as chemtrails. 3. Rewild the planet, and that comes under the green movement. That's where you get your core reserves, your inner buffers, your outer buffers, and your corridors. The atomic warhead concept, actually, high-altitude explosions were carried out, but they had nothing to do with Alternative 1 insofar as we can find out. And then later test ban treaties prohibited the concept of using atomic warheads for this purpose. Did they use HAARP?
The Department of Defense continued its advance into space by conducting 5 high-altitude tests above Johnston Island. Most of these bombs were carried aloft by the Air Force's Thor missile to continue the research of neutralizing incoming enemy warheads high above the Earth. Nuclear weapon testing had joined the space age.
This small step toward safety can be followed by others, longer and less limited, if also harder in the taking. With our courage and understanding enlarged by this achievement, let us press onward in quest of man's essential desire for peace. As President of the United States, and with the advice and consent of the Senate, I now sign the instruments of ratification of this treaty.
Tightrope was the last atmospheric test ever conducted by the United States, and it was fired from Johnston Island in the Nike Hercules air defense missile and detonated again well above Johnston Island. And that ended this whole series of atmospheric testing by the United States, when in 1963 we entered the Limited Test Ban Treaty that prohibits any atmospheric testing.
The Earth is more unstable now. It wobbles more than it used to. The atmosphere is speeding up and the Earth is slowing down. The Earth's core is getting hotter. The magnetic north is changing. The sun is more active and older than we once thought. Everything is more unpredictable, and humans seem always willing to push things to the limit. The late Carl Sagan said, "We've arranged a global civilization in which most crucial elements profoundly depend on science and technology. We've also arranged things so that almost no one understands science or technology. We might get away with it for a while, but sooner or later, this combustible mixture of ignorance and power is going to blow up in our faces." Imagine the Earth's atmosphere, also known as the ionosphere, as a thick soap bubble. It is a membrane, a natural electrically charged shield around the Earth, protecting all life from deadly solar radiation.
We have to have the atmosphere for survival. I don't think we should do anything to damage it.
Without the ionosphere, I'd be fried, you'd be fried, all life on Earth would be fried.
In 1912, Nikola Tesla, a visionary genius, saw ways to tame the sky, to make the atmosphere glow. He developed alternating current, high-frequency radio technology, and free energy. He experimented with both high and low frequencies and electromagnetic waves. He envisioned altering the weather and creating shields around the Earth to protect us from missiles, and he claimed he knew how to split the Earth in two. In 1985, Bernard Eastlund applied for patents that could make some of these ideas real. Many claim that these patents have become the blueprint for HAARP, High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program.
HAARP began with a congressional insertion in the appropriations bill of fiscal year 1990. In essence, Congress directed the Defense Department to explore the potential for using the auroral regions for improving communications and navigation and surveillance. From there, the assignment came that the Navy and the Air Force were to manage the program. It is people from those two organizations that have worked together for the past 7 years.
Applications discussed in the patents included destroying missiles. Communications control and disruption were included. There were some other ideas both to possibly modify weather and finally to lift a portion of the upper atmosphere further out into space where hopefully it would be able to deflect missile trajectories.
Applications to military acknowledges that it can literally lift the ionosphere, and what they say is it's not a problem, it's a short period of time, yet when you lift the ionosphere up, the lower atmosphere rushes in and fills that void, which changes localized weather patterns. Document that really brought HAARP into being, and the absolute requirements ran from 1 gigawatt, which is 1 billion watts, all the way up to 10 billion watts of effective radiated power with a desired level of 100 billion watts.
At its biggest size suggested, if you beamed it for an hour and a half, that would equal the energy in a hydrogen bomb.
It's just a person's concept of what might possibly be done. Doesn't necessarily mean the government endorsed it or not.
What's the power when it pulses? And I can't find that in any of the documents that I've looked at. If you have a very small battery, you can put it in a small pen light and turn it on and have for some time a little bit of light. You can take the exactly same battery and put it in your camera, and when you flash that camera, the light will blind you. The nature of radar and these electromagnetic supplies is they can usually be pulsed. So one very good question for people to ask is, what is the peak power of that antenna when it pulses at its full capability?
Pulsing it doesn't matter.
To make it bigger, all they'd have to do is add additional elements. In fact, the request for proposal specified a design that could be added onto.
The first module is what's called a developmental prototype, and that's 48 antennas in a 6x8 array.
What you're looking at is the HAARP site in Alaska, or at least about 1/5 of the HAARP site. When this is completed, you'll see about 180 of these poles. Together, those 180 poles make up one single antenna, designed along with these cross members and a wire mesh here to send all the information, all the radio frequency energy that is generated by these trailers up into the ionosphere.
As they acknowledge in their papers when they say, we don't know what will happen when we push it to the next level of effects.
The military record explains it as phase one of a multi-phase project. It's going to get bigger, it's going to continue, and that's again why we're concerned.
If they were going to use atomic weapons to blow holes in the heavens, and HAARP could produce the same effect, then why not try using HAARP in experiments to reduce global warming? They could well be doing that. And of course, we wouldn't know anything about it. HAARP can be used also for 1, weather modification and control, producing earthquakes, 3, underground surveillance, 4, deep water communications with submarines, 5, biological alterations, 6, or for disease and whatnot, 6 is mind control, and 7, high altitude defense shields. This is HAARP technology. This is Tesla technology.
We do know about electromagnetic systems and electromagnetic warfare is becoming even more interesting. As late as April 28, 1997, U.S. Secretary of Defense Cohen announced at University of Georgia that, in fact, geophysical warfare was becoming a more intense problem. In fact, they even speculated that terrorist organizations would have systems that could modify weather, create volcanic eruptions, or even cause earthquakes using electromagnetic waves.
You know, earthquakes is another thing. We have had a lot of them, a lot of volcanoes more in the last few years. Whether or not that is just a cycle of happenings, because we've had a history of earthquakes and volcanoes throughout recorded history, but it just seems to me like that it's coming more often, and that there has to be some connection with some of the things that we as humans are doing to our Earth.
The issue of earthquakes has been, looked at by other specialists, even going back to the work of J.F. Gordon MacDonald when he was at UCLA in the late 60s. He was also a science advisor. Lyndon Johnson is a specialist in geophysical warfare. He asserted then if you could ever get enough energy in at just the right frequency and just the right waveform, you could in fact trigger these kinds of events. And I think that's exactly what the Secretary of Defense, Cohen, was saying just a few days ago, was it's this idea that now terrorists may possess this kind of technology. It's obvious. I mean, if we're concerned that terrorists have it, we certainly do.
Back in 1912, Nikola Tesla said it was possible to split the planet by combining the correct vibrations with the resonance of the planet itself.
The idea of affecting weather for many people, it gets to the point where you say, well, can that even be real? And when you go back in time, even to 1976, the United States, along with over 60 other countries, signed an accord where we agreed to not use weather manipulation as a weapon of war. This is before biological and chemical treaties, before many of the nuclear disarmament treaties. And yet, that was such a big threat in 76. Has the science progressed? Certainly.
We're in this sea of energy. We're in a sea of gases. We're in a sea of particles that are charged. And they're moving constantly, just like a current in the ocean, just like the wind in the atmosphere. This current forms. And you draw and you attract these particles. Well, Wilhelm Reich attracted these particles. He pointed it at the sky and he said, you want clouds to be built there? You got a drought? He would point the device at that place and clouds would form there.
In the 40s, there was interest in weather modification. That by the 50s, there was actual experimentation in that area. By the 1960s, that area had advanced substantially.
Well, there have been programs with salting clouds, salting things with silver iodide, and there's been some experiments where people from airplanes threw chaff out, the little pieces of metal, and tried to get those to absorb power.
We have done such damage to the thermal balance, to the hydrologic balance of this planet at this point. We are seeing more and more disasters. You have to watch the news. You have to notice these things. You can't just take Prozac and forget about it, and the next day you see the whole Ohio River Valley was just flooded. Billions of dollars of damage. Thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of people left without homes. And they actually say that they can make weather. Well, tell me, have you noticed any good weather here lately? The thing that people don't take into account is we are changing the entire density of our atmosphere, the viscosity of the atmosphere's ability to flow and be fluid, to be freely flowing. We're changing that.
Today we have a number of technologies, not just HAARP, but satellites and other ionosphere heaters placed in strategic locations all over the world that can create the disruptions in lightning.
Here's a paper that was recently unearthed that talks about creating what's called a highly ionized column up through the atmosphere.
It might trigger lightning if lightning was ready to occur, and suddenly this conductor was thrust in the middle, into the situation, then yeah, it could.
If you beam this radio wave into the ionosphere and you continually charge it up, not only are you sending energy into the ionosphere, but you're providing a path for energy to come back down out of the ionosphere.
In other words, they can create a massive discharge of lightning, bigger than anything we've ever seen on this planet.
And if you aim the beam at the down, and it happens to be in a region where there's a lot of charge, you can initiate a discharge in that area, perhaps.
Alternative 3 suggested there was secret top-level collusion between the Soviet Union and the United States. HAARP research and the Soviet woodpecker ELF research began by secret agreement in 1974. Woodpecker actually began operations on July 4th, 1976. All of it is based on Tesla technology, and all of it is dangerous.
National Political Studies is a non-government organisation based in London's St James's. It was Grodin's linking of the Pentagon with the Kremlin and the implications behind it that brought me here to talk to Professor G. Gordon Broadbent, author of a major study of US-Soviet diplomacy since the 1950s.
The short answer is that I know nothing of US-Soviet relations beyond what has already been made public. We had the celebrated docking in space some time ago. This was presented as an isolated exercise, and as far as I know, was exactly that. Maybe paving the way for more to come. Though on the broader issues of Soviet-US cooperation, there is an element of mystery which puzzles many people in my field. To put it at its simplest, None of us can understand how it is that the peace has been maintained for the past 25 years.
You mean the experts are baffled?
But also, for once, in agreement. The popular myth that it's been improved for the balance of nuclear power doesn't, frankly, hold up entirely. And the more you look at it, the less sense it makes. There are too many imbalances, especially when you put it in the perspective of history.
So what is your explanation?
Essentially, what we're suggesting is that at the very highest level of East-West diplomacy, there is operating a factor of which we know nothing. Now, it could just be, that this unknown factor is a massive but covered operation in space. As for the reason behind it, well, we're not in the business of speculation.
The Bible makes it very clear that there is collusion at the highest levels of the elite, and that there really are no national boundaries. There are no nations or states insofar as they are concerned. The super black operations may involve all major nations, and we have evidence to substantiate that we'll get to later. Therefore, Alternative 3 is an effort that most likely involves top scientists and specialists from all the major nations in the world. They operate totally outside all national and international law. HARP is but one of many of these efforts. Interesting article appeared in Newswatch magazine. David J. Smith, Illuminati Collusion is a fact of life, according to this article. It should be noted that Brzezinski's book, Between Two Agers, he wrote, not only have new weapons been developed, but some of the basic concepts of geography and strategy have been fundamentally altered. Space and weather control have replaced Suez and Gibraltar as key elements of strategy. That's a fascinating statement when you stop and think about it. Technology will make available to the leaders of major nations a variety of techniques for conducting secret warfare, of which only a bare minimum of security forces need be appraised. One nation might attack a competitor covertly. Techniques of weather modification could be employed to produce prolonged periods of drought or storm, thereby weakening a nation's capacity and forcing it to accept, of course, the demands of the attacker. Isn't that fascinating? We've moved into a whole new area. In 1977, the Trilateral Report stated, as an Arctic power, the Soviet Union should have considerable interest in bringing national weather modification efforts under some kind of international consultation procedures. Many details about the early U.S.-Soviet work on world weather engineering was published in Lowell Ponte's book, The Cooling. Because he worked as a researcher in the Pentagon-associated think tank, Ponte was able to obtain details about secret U.S.-Soviet scientific cooperation for weather engineering. And in fact, of course, you have HARP on this side, you have Woodpecker on the other. The U.S. government is now building a mammoth electromagnetic weather engineering system that is based upon the design of Bernard J. Eastland. And you saw Eastland on that video on HARP. On September 6, 1987, National Public Radio reported Dr. Eastland stated that his new invention could be used to change the weather by redirecting the very high wind patterns. We know them as a jet stream. The invention uses an Earth-based power source to create electromagnetic radio waves and focuses them way up into the atmosphere. Dr. Eastland says the invention could steer the jet stream, but could also be used to disrupt communications all over the world. And of course, we had that situation in Tennessee, which we're going to get to. That was part of a HARP experiment. These systems, together with Russian Woodpecker Tesla magnifying transmitters, have created a severe alteration of global weather patterns, beginning in 1976, of course, when Woodpecker began, but intensifying throughout the 80s and 90s as more ELF transmitting stations were constructed. The new Gakona HARP project is only the beginning stage of a much larger system. Later, the antenna array will be vastly expanded and radiate power of 1.7 gigawatts, billions of watts, making it the most powerful one in the world. ELF waves are tied to big earthquakes. In a February 1912 interview in the publication The World Today, Nikola Tesla said that it would be possible to split the planet by combining vibrations with the correct resonance of the Earth itself. Within a few weeks, I could set the Earth crust into such a state of vibrations that it would rise and fall hundreds of feet, throwing rivers out of their beds, wrecking buildings, and practically destroying civilization. The article was called Tesla's Controlled Earthquakes. July 11th, 1935, New York American said, Tesla's experiments in transmitting mechanical vibrations through the Earth called him the art of telegeodynamics, were roughly described by the scientist as a sort of controlled earthquake. Imagine having this kind of power. You can modify the weather and you can make earthquakes. Describing early Soviet work with Tesla's method of controlled earthquakes, of the many great earthquakes of '76, there is one that demands special attention, the July 28, 1976 Tangshan, China earthquake. The reason that this 1976 earthquake attracted my attention, he said, is that it was preceded by a light flare-up of the entire sky over Tangshan. Also, this earthquake occurred during the first month of Soviet woodpecker radio emissions. Isn't that interesting that they would have that kind of power so they can weather warfare, earthquake warfare. And of course, if you can produce earthquakes, you can also produce volcanoes as well. In other words, we're having power being given over to an elite in black operations of which the human masses have no say over. No say over at all. The most prominent effect in this earthquake, because of these woodpecker radio emissions, was when the Soviet woodpecker emission was on at full strength. The sky would light up like an ionized gas lamp, just as Tesla had predicted. The June 5th, '77 New York Times described the great earthquake, which destroyed Tangshan, killed over 650,000 people. Just before the first tremor at 3:42 a.m., the sky lit up like daylight. The multi-hued lights, mainly white and red, were seen up to 200 miles away. Leaves on many trees were burned to a crisp, and growing vegetables were scorched on one side as if by a fireball. These electrical effects are tied to electromagnetic frequencies. At about 10:45 a.m. Friday, radio station WJKM and CMR Country Music Radio, with studios in Hartsville, Tennessee, was knocked off the air by a very strange energy blast. There was crystal clear blue sky, there were no clouds, no rain, and there was no lightning. All the radio station's lines were knocked out. Several power transformers were blown several blocks away from the studios. Smoke was seen billowing out of one of them. All phone lines at the newspaper, the Hartsville Vedette, and a local farm co-op, and all other phones in this small radius were knocked out. Radio station transmitters lost all MOSFETs at the output. All computers at WJKM lost motherboards, network cards, etc. The ISDN was knocked out. Most of all the equipment, Zephyr codes and EAS, were also knocked out. Then they showed pictures of these birds. Hundreds of birds were burned to death. Isn't that strange? You see, we have technology, and they're experimenting on people, radio stations, probably the Chinese earthquake, and they don't care. And that's one of the things you have to keep in mind about this thing. They just flat don't care. If it hurts people, if it kills people, that's just the way it is. Tesla technology is real, and it is being tested. And that's something you have to know and understand. Doeth great wonders, so that he maketh fire come down from heaven on the earth in sight of men, and deceiveth them that dwell on the earth. by the means of those miracles. This is about the Antichrist. High technology. They use high technology to accomplish bringing in their false Messiah. All of this dovetails together. It may not seem like it does, but it does.